Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to get seriously nerdy with me today?
Always. What we're diving into today.
We are talking all about Russia. Well, more specifically, we are talking about Russian politics from Lenin all the way to Putin.
So we're trying to unpack how these different leaders throughout Russia's history, how they handled this balance between wanting to be completely in charge, like absolute power,
Right.
but also needing, a functional system of government. And lucky for us, we have a great book to dig into all this Russian politics from Lenin to Putin.
Russian Politics from Lenin to Putin, edited by Stephen Fortescue. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, what's the takeaway for our listeners here? What makes this such a fascinating deep dive?
Well, because these power struggles that we're going to be talking about, they didn't just stay within Russia's borders, right? I mean, they've really shaped how Russia acts on the world stage, even still today.
Yeah.
So if we can understand this balancing act going all the way back to the beginning, it gives us a much better grasp on, well, Russia in general. And the excerpt actually calls this the logic of specialization.
Okay.
Which basically means that for a government to actually be effective, any government,
Right.
but you need input from a lot of different voices, a lot of different areas of expertise.
Sure. Makes sense. You need people who understand agriculture and finance and, military strategy, like all the big stuff.
Yeah, you need your specialists.
Yeah. But it's not always that simple, is it? Because then you drop in a powerful leader, someone like, Lenin or Stalin, who are going to come up a little bit later, and suddenly all those different voices, all those different opinions, they can start to sound like a lot of noise.
Oh, yeah. It's like that old saying, too many cooks in the kitchen.
Exactly. And Lenin, he learned this the hard way. Early on, he sets up this thing called the Sovnarkom, which is basically their version of like a cabinet of ministers.
Okay.
He's hoping it's going to make things more efficient,
Right.
streamline decision-making. But instead, all these different groups, all these different ministries, they just kept bringing their disagreements to him.
Oh, no. So much for efficiency. Yeah. Right. He wanted them to work it out amongst themselves, but it ended up creating more chaos than it solved. And this is a pattern we see throughout Russian history, right?
Yeah, it's like you bring all these brilliant minds together, each one an expert in their own right, but then you try to get them all pulling in the same direction.
Right. And then nobody wants to take the blame when things inevitably go wrong.
Oh, for sure. Everyone wants to be able to say, well, that wasn't my department.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this all led to Lenin relying more and more on the Politburo.
Which is...
Oh, sorry. The Politburo, that's the Communist Party's top leadership, kind of their inner circle. Lenin really didn't want the party bogged down in the day-to-day details of governing,
Right.
But as this excerpt explains, that's kind of what ended up happening. He thought the Sovnarkom would handle it, but the party apparatus, it just kept growing. More rules, more procedures, more people.
And that brings us to Stalin, right? I don't think anyone would accuse him of being a fan of bureaucracy.
No, not at all. Stalin was all about control. He basically said, forget all those government agencies.
I got this.
I've got my people. He relied on this small, super loyal group of advisors to make decisions quickly.
Streamlined for sure. But talk about risky. You're putting all your trust, all your power in the hands of a very select few. What if they give you bad advice? Or what if they decide they want your power?
And that's exactly the thing. The text really highlights how risky this approach was. As decisive as Stalin was, even a dictator needs to listen to other people, right? People who actually understand the complexities of running a country.
Yeah, otherwise you're just flying blind.
Exactly. And there's plenty of evidence that Stalin's go-it-alone approach, it led to some pretty major policy mistakes.
But he did understand that he needed to keep his inner circle happy, right? The excerpt actually compares it to a mafia family. Ruthless, absolutely, but with an understanding that loyalty had to be rewarded.
It's a fascinating and terrifying power dynamic. He couldn't tolerate any dissent, any real disagreement, but he also couldn't rule entirely alone. He needed his people, but only as long as they were his people, if you get what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. High stakes all around. So after Stalin passes away, do things settle down a bit?
Settle down? Not quite. I think a better way to put it is, after Stalin dies, it's like someone finally opened a window in a really stuffy room. Except instead of fresh air rushing in,
Right.
it's this whirlwind of uncertainty.
Yeah.
Everyone's holding their breath. And that's when Khrushchev comes in. He's ready to shake things up, dismantle a lot of what Stalin had put in place.
And did he?
Oh, he was very good at the dismantling part. The rebuilding, the creating something new, not so much.
So it's like he tore down the old house without having a blueprint for the new one.
That's a great way to put it. And this is where things get really interesting because the excerpt talks about this idea of crypto politics.
Crypto, like Bitcoin.
Not exactly. This is crypto-like. Think spy thriller, shadowy figures whispering in dark corners. But it's actually all about bureaucratic infighting. Think about different factions within the government all jockeying for power, for resources, but it's all happening behind closed doors.
Okay, so less outright dictatorship, more like office politics, but on a national scale.
Exactly. And under Brezhnev, this maneuvering, this subtle shifting of power, it continued. But Brezhnev, he took it to a whole new level.
Intriguing. What made his approach so different?
Well, Stalin was all about control, right? Brezhnev, on the other hand, he was all about consensus. He wanted everyone to agree before any decision was made.
Which sounds, well, it sounds good, on paper at least.
Yeah.
Everyone plays nice, decisions are unanimous.
Right. But we both know how well those group projects usually go.
True, true.
Yeah, and in reality, this obsession with consensus, it just led to complete stagnation. Nobody wanted to rock the boat. Nobody wanted to challenge the status quo. And that meant very few risks were taken. So things just ground to a halt.
Ah, so it's like that old saying, what is it? A camel is a horse designed by a committee.
Oof, yeah. That's a pretty accurate analogy.
So we've gone from Lenin trying to wrangle his experts to Stalin ruling with an iron fist. Then there's Khrushchev, who tears everything down without a plan for what comes next. And then Brezhnev, the king of consensus, presiding over this period of massive stagnation. Which, of course, brings us to Gorbachev. He's the one who finally tries to, actually reform the system from within, right?
Enter Gorbachev, stage left, and he's got big ideas. Glasnost, which means openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He genuinely wanted to reform the Soviet system, not destroy it. But he learned the hard way that sometimes even the best intentions can have unintended consequences.
Kind of like accidentally opening Pandora's box.
Exactly. Gorbachev, he wanted to loosen the government's control a bit, allow for some freedom of speech, some open debate, get people talking again. But by doing that, he inadvertently gave more power to the people who wanted to see the entire system dismantled.
And I imagine after decades of repression, of stagnation, there are probably a lot of people who were ready for change, even radical change.
Absolutely. And the text gives this incredible example from the 1989 elections.
Okay.
Gorbachev's trying to manage things, keep them from getting out of control.
Sure.
But it backfires big time. The Communist Party, they try to control the process as much as they can.
Right.
But a huge number of their candidates are defeated.
Wait, seriously? They still lost, even with the party pulling strings behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah. People were fed up. They'd had enough. They wanted change. It's amazing. The text even mentions how Pravda, the official Communist Party newspaper, they publicly complained about the election results.
Wow. If the party newspaper is criticizing you, you know you've messed up.
Right. And that's the thing about unintended consequences. Gorbachev, he was just trying to patch a few cracks in the system, but he ended up, blowing the whole thing wide open. And it's a really important reminder about this whole idea of legitimacy, which the text talks about a lot.
Right, legitimacy. How do these leaders, all of them, from Lenin to Gorbachev, and of course we'll get to Putin, but how do they justify their right to rule? It's more than just brute force, right?
Exactly. There has to be something more, something that convinces people, both everyday people and the people in charge of making the system work, that this person, this system, is legitimate.
It's like that old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. You can force people to obey, but to have real lasting power, you need something more. The book talked about different types of legitimacy, right?
Right, it did. There's popular legitimacy, which is when the people accept you as their leader, whether they genuinely like you or they've just kind of resigned themselves to it.
Okay.
Then there's what the book calls staff legitimacy, which is basically getting the buy-in from the people who make the system work. The bureaucrats, the officials, the ones actually in charge of implementing policies.
Ah, so you need the support of the people on the ground and the people in the offices making sure the trains run on time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not always either or. Sometimes it's a combination of both. The text looks at everything from goal-oriented legitimacy.
Which?
Achieving specific outcomes that gain support for the leader.
Okay.
To charismatic legitimacy, which is all about a leader's personality and how they inspire people.
Yeah.
And then there's eudaimonic legitimacy, which is about delivering results, making people's lives better in a tangible way.
Got it. So Lenin grappled with these powerful agencies. Stalin ruled through fear and loyalty. Khrushchev couldn't quite figure out how to build something new after he tore the old system down. And Brezhnev's consensus-driven approach led to stagnation. And through it all, these different types of legitimacy, they're all at play, shaping how each leader tries to maintain control. Which, of course, brings us to the post-Soviet era and two very, very different leaders, Yeltsin and Putin. They both inherited a whole new set of challenges.
Yeah, you go from this massive empire, the Soviet Union, to, well, basically starting from scratch.
Yeah.
I can't imagine what it must have been like for Yeltsin, inheriting all that, trying to build a functioning country practically overnight.
It was a mess, absolutely. And the text really emphasizes how much Yeltsin relied on his charisma early on, just to try and hold things together. I mean, think about it.
Right. People are looking for change. They want something different. After the Brezhnev years, after Gorbachev, they want a leader who's strong and decisive.
And Yeltsin definitely had that, at first at least. Standing up to the hardliners when they tried to overthrow Gorbachev, talking about democracy and reform, big personality, and it was a time that seemed to call for a big personality.
He did. He really did. But charisma can only take you so far. As time went on, and the problems, the economic problems, the crime, it all just kept piling up.
It's like they say, you can outrun your problems for a while, but eventually...
They catch up with you. And that's what happened to Yeltsin. He struggled with his health, with alcohol, and Russia was struggling right along with him.
And that's the backdrop for Putin's rise to power. Talk about a complete 180 from Yeltsin, at least in terms of his image. In control, disciplined, a former KGB agent.
Right. And the text points out how careful Putin has been in crafting this image of strength, of being almost untouchable. And part of that is this idea he talked about, establishing a, quote, dictatorship of laws, end quote. Which, I mean...
Yeah, that's a little ominous, to say the least. What does that even mean in practice?
It's about control, ultimately. Projecting this image of power, but giving it a veneer of legality. It's Putin's way of saying, look, I'm in charge, but it's not because I say so. It's because these are the rules.
But he's the one making the rules, right?
Exactly. And it's interesting, the excerpt actually draws a parallel to this idea that Weber talked about, the Rechtsstaat.
Which, I'll be honest, sounds like something I should know, but...
Oh, it's simpler than it sounds.
Yeah.
Rechtsstaat, it basically means a state that's based on law, but not necessarily on democracy, if that makes sense.
So having laws, but not necessarily having all the things we associate with a true democracy, like checks and balances or, protecting individual rights.
Right. It's about order. It's about stability, even if it means less individual freedom.
Which is a very different way of thinking about the relationship between a government and its people, at least compared to, a lot of Western countries.
Very different. And it brings us right back to the heart of what we've been talking about this whole time. This tension, this push and pull between a strong leader and institutions that can function on their own, between personal power and a system of government that's bigger than any one person.
It's really incredible when you think about it. We've been looking at over a century of Russian history, and that same tension, it just keeps popping up again and again.
It really does. Mm-hmm. And I think the text makes it clear that this isn't just ancient history, right? It's still playing out today. Putin has, for better or worse, built a system that really revolves around him. But the big question, the one nobody has an answer to yet, is what happens next?
What happens when Putin's no longer in charge? Does Russia go back to the old ways, to the strongman tactics of a Stalin? Or is there some other path? Is there a way to balance personal power and a functioning system to find some kind of equilibrium?
That's the million-ruble question, isn't it? I don't think any of us have a crystal ball to see the future. But I will say this, understanding these historical forces that we've been talking about, understanding this balancing act, it's crucial for anyone who wants to understand Russia, not just its past, but where it's headed in the 21st century.
It's like they say, those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I think we'll leave our listeners with plenty to ponder. This has been a fascinating deep dive, to say the least. From Lenin's revolution all the way to Putin's dictatorship of laws, we've covered a lot of ground. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another journey into the heart of a complex topic.